That's right. And so this is a very important question, and this can be a controversial question. Uh, in the 1960s, a lot of Jewish leaders and Jewish organizations were at the forefront, along with Martin Luther King, in the civil rights movement. The Jewish leaders played a huge role in uplifting the Black community. Now, the relationship between the Black community and the Jewish community in USA has deteriorated. You saw that after October the 7th, a lot of BLM chapters professed their sympathies and support for Palestinians, Palestinian, I don't know if I can say this, Palestinian militants.
Hmm.
How did the relationship, you know,
Yeah.
how it become so fraught?
There's a lot there's a big answer to this question. There's many different pieces. You're right. Jews were instrumental in the civil rights movement in the US, not just for Black Americans, also for women. The women's civil rights movement and the Black civil rights movement, which were happening at the same time, Jews were so overrepresented in these movements. I mean, Jews are only 2% of America. And if you start looking at the names of the people who were not Black, who were in that movement, it's overwhelmingly Jewish. And if you look at the women who led the women's movement, it is overwhelmingly Jewish.
When you say
It's
women's movement,
also
women's movement in 1960s or the women's movement
in
during the World
1960s.
War One where they were fighting for suffrage?
No, 1960s, because
Okay.
there weren't so many Jews earlier. And
Okay.
Jews weren't, Jews were in a very different position in America before the 1920s. In the 1960s, Jews were, active, full citizens, members of this country, still suffering from discrimination at the time, but they were fighting the fights for women, as Jewish women. I mean, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she's part of that battle. She's Jewish. Gloria Steinem's father is Jewish. Bella Abzug is Jewish. Um, Many of them were Jewish. The ACLU was run by Jews. The NAACP, the legal organization established to fight for the rights of Black Americans, was started by Jews. So that is all quite true. What went wrong? Because there really was deep allyship. I think there's a lot of things that happened. I think Jews uh, really became very successful in the United States uh, after the 1960s, between the 1960s and today. So before civil rights, Jews were also banned from, Jews couldn't get a job at a regular law firm. They couldn't get jobs in Hollywood. They
What?
Jews couldn't get into country clubs. Like Jews were discriminated against before the civil rights movement as
No, the Jewish people own a lot of studios in Hollywood.
right, because they started their own studios because they couldn't get
Okay.
hired at the others. They
Okay.
also started their own law firms. Today, some of the top law firms in the world and the top studios in Hollywood are the Jewish ones, but we had to start our own because they wouldn't allow us in.
Okay.
So we just surpassed them as far as success.
So nowadays, all say that Jews are controlling Hollywood and
I
banks.
mean, there is a huge Jewish presence in Hollywood, of course, and there are a lot of Jews who have been in film for a very, very long time. But yeah, Jews are in Hollywood. I mean, Jews are in a lot
But,
of industries. Jews are
but why they are? Yeah, but, I mean they became a predominant force in Hollywood because because of discrimination they suffered.
they were excluded, so they
Yeah.
started they started all of their own studios, and that's why, Metro Goldwyn Mayer, MGM. Those are
Okay, got
three
it.
Jewish last names,
Okay.
right? These are a lot of them are Jewish studios that were set up, but they had to set up their own because they were being discriminated against. But
Okay.
in the 19s, also Jews couldn't join country clubs. My law firm that I worked at, one of the first law firm that I worked at out of law school, I worked for a partner, a Jewish woman. And when she went to that firm, it was the only firm in town that would hire a woman and a Jew to be a lawyer. And that's why she went to that firm, because none of the other firms would hire Jews or women in that time. So anyway, once civil rights, as we move forward, Jews were no longer being discriminated against, and Jews were able then to kind of move freely in all different areas, right? In country clubs, also neighborhoods. There used to be
Okay.
deed restrictions, neighborhoods. You couldn't buy in a certain neighborhood if you were Black or Jewish or whatever other groups they didn't want.
Okay. So I didn't know this actually. Civil rights was also about Jews.
It wasn't the movement never was about Jews, but the consequences of civil rights was that Jews also stopped being
Okay.
discriminated against. Jews were being discriminated against. Jews weren't in a movement. You know what
Okay.
Jews did? They started their own law firms. They
Okay.
weren't fighting the system to change the law. Instead, they just started their own law firms. They started their own medical practices. They started their own country clubs.
Okay.
But after civil rights, discrimination was outlawed against anyone. You couldn't discriminate against women or on the basis of race or on the basis of religion. So no
Okay.
one was allowed to discriminate. In the case of Jews, many Jews, you don't know that a person is a Jew unless they tell you.
Okay.
So they blend in to white American society, even
Okay.
though before that they were considered not white. And so
Okay.
as Jews were blending in and continuing to achieve success, I think that the narrative was
Okay.
changed, that everyone forgot that Jews were also one of these discriminated against minorities and instead
Okay.
said, huh, look at those Jews. They're partners at these firms and they're running a studio in Hollywood and they have all
Okay.
the success. And they rewrote history to say that somehow we were the oppressors instead of also being discriminated against and also being allies with the other groups that were being discriminated against. History was rewritten, and this is part of, again, it actually ties back to this cultural Marxist ideology
Okay.
because that ideology, um, and even critical race theory, all of these ideologies are based in an idea that the system was built intentionally to exclude certain groups.
Okay.
And
Okay.
if you are a group that's excluded, you cannot succeed because the system was designed to exclude you. The problem for Jews, and it's not just Jews, it's also a problem for a lot of Asian Americans, including Indians and also Southeast Asian Americans, like a lot of different Asian groups, is that Jews outperform white men in the US. Again, so do a lot of Asian groups. But
Yeah.
this is a problem because if you're oppressed, how are you outperforming these groups? It doesn't, the ideology says, oh, it's untrue. So, yeah, I think history was rewritten. And most Americans, if you ask them, oh, were Jews ever discriminated against? They would say, oh, no, of course not. Are Jews white? They would say, oh, yes, of course they are. And neither of those are really true statements. Jews were discriminated against, and they were discriminated against for being not white. That was when I was told that I was white as a young woman, it was such an interesting thing. I understand my complexion, nobody can tell the difference between me and an Italian person, let's say. Um, but, I was raised knowing that my grandparents' whole families were brutally murdered. Why? Because they were not white. That is why they were murdered, for being not Aryan, not white. And then all of a sudden, now people say, "Oh, but you're white." It's a very, it's because these are constructs, these are social constructs, they're not even real things, right? And so we can change the meaning. So I
Got
think
it.
this,
Yeah.
this is a major piece of it. I think another piece is that
So, at what point did it start to fracture the relationship between Black community and Jewish community?
I think probably in the 80s. I mean, you already see it, 80s and 90s. You see it with Jesse Jackson. Jesse Jackson was a leader of the Black community, and he really didn't like Jews. Now, Malcolm X also didn't like Jews, and the whole Nation of Islam is really problematic for Jews. I mean, Farrakhan hates Jews and
Oh my
continues to
God.
hate Jews.
Farrakhan,
So,
yes.
all of the Black nationalist movements, unfortunately, are very anti-Semitic. And I think also part of it is also the Islamicization of Black Americans. Black
Are
Americans
not the
became Christian.
Ethiopian Jews fighting in the IDF? Aren't the Ethiopian Jews fighting in the
Of course,
IDF?
of course.
They are blacks, right?
Israel is the only country that has ever taken Blacks out of Africa to bring
Okay.
them to freedom.
Okay.
Any other group who has ever taken Black people out of Africa has taken them to slavery. We
Okay.
are the only people who rescued our people out of Africa to take them away from being massacred and to bring
Okay.
them to freedom.
Okay. I mean, this is a controversial question. I mean, you feel free to not answer this. I have some black friends who say that not black acquaintances who say that blacks are the first Jews. We are the real Jews. Uh,
Ah, the Black Israelite movement.
we are the real Jews. They are not the real Jews. Like, I mean, I don't know much about this.
Yeah.
Can you?
They're
Can
just nuts. Those are crazy people. They're delusional. Like that's just not true at all. It's absurd. Now, the Ethiopian Jews are real Jews. So it's not that there are not black Jews. There are black Jews because King David had a queen who was black and African, and then they went back to Africa. And then there was an entire, and there are Jewish tribes also in Uganda and in other countries in Africa, who have been there forever.
Mm.
So, yeah, there is a Black Israelite movement. One of the people who killed, I think the ones who killed people in a Jewish supermarket in New Jersey. They were the
Yes,
Black Israelites. And I
yes.
remember when I was a kid, I lived in Philadelphia. We used to go to New York City, and they were there then when I was a kid. They would be like standing on the side handing out pamphlets. And I remember as a kid being like, what is happening? Like, who are these? So yeah, those are people who are just, I think they're just nuts. Like, I don't know what they're talking about. There are also people who say, and there's even a professor at Columbia University who says that the Jews are European, that we are descendants of the Khazars, who I don't even know who the Khazars are, but apparently there was some anyway, it's a lie that is just a made up mythical tale that is being spread to.
But there are people who buy into those lies, right?
There are people who buy into those lies. I think, again, you know what? Maybe I'm underestimating them. I underestimated the lies that are, I've been underestimating a lot of the lies that were being told for many years. And so this is something where I'm like, oh, they're crazy. We don't have to
Is it your
worry
defense
about that.
mechanism?
Hmm?
Is it your defense mechanism to underestimate?
Perhaps. Good question. I don't know. But I did underestimate. So maybe I should take this more seriously because in my mind, I'm like, that's what I'm like, oh, that's so stupid. Who would believe that? But you're right. I mean, people believe all sorts of things.
Okay. Okay, good. So from whatever interactions I have had with you, I believe that you are a First Amendment absolutist, if I'm right.
I don't know if
Uh,
I would say absolutist, but I really believe in the First Amendment.
okay. So previously, the when people were some groups were viciously opposed to First Amendment right in the name of offense and trigger warnings. Okay, do you remember it happened during George Floyd killings?
Yes.
Now, when Claudine Gay, the Harvard University president, goes for testification and says that, yes, it depends on the context when you say that you want to kill a Jew or you want to commit a genocide on Jewish people. Now, this so-called free speech warriors were at the forefront and they were saying no, she should have been protected by First Amendment right. It's America. She has the right to free speech. But where was that right to free speech when you were shutting down the speech during COVID? How do you, as a law professor, how do you look at this debate?
Yeah. People are hypocrites. People are hypocrites. So, I teach employment discrimination. It's one of the courses that I teach. And employment discrimination, like Title VI, it's all civil rights law. Title VI applies to the universities. Title VII, which is the one I teach, applies to employment. And in both cases, we have an entire area of law called harassment law. And harassment law limits speech, right? It definitely limits speech. If you can't say to a woman in the workplace, disgusting things about wanting to touch her or sleep with her or whatever, which would be harassing, then that
Yes,
is a limitation of speech. And when the
yes,
government passes a law that limits speech, it's subject to a First Amendment challenge. For whatever reason, no one really challenges or did challenge any of these kind of civil rights laws as challenging as being a violation of the First Amendment. We kind of accepted that the government has the power to restrict speech that is harassing. There are other areas of speech that we know can be limited because the Supreme Court said they can be limited. So, incitement to violence, that is not protected speech. Okay. And defamation is not protected speech. So we have areas that are not protected speech. Threats, true threats are not protected speech. Harassment is kind of this gray area. And what we saw for the last, 50, 60 years, not 56, because harassment law really is in the 80s. So since about the 80s, what we saw was uh, a real comfort among most Americans, not all, but certainly among liberals and people on the left, that, you know what, it is okay for the government to restrict speech that is more than offensive, that is harassing, because it causes harm. So the government can restrict that speech and it's not a First Amendment problem. It's got worse in the last, let's say, 15 years, especially on college campuses, where it wasn't just harassment that was being punished, but it really was, even offensive, what we now call microaggressions, right?
Yes, microaggression.
And even if some students were being disciplined for that, but even if they weren't being disciplined for it, they're being ostracized for it, and they're being otherwise like socially punished for it. And we've had this happening. So I had concerns about that before, right? I did not agree with how restricted speech had become. For example, in my classes, when I'm teaching a constitutional law case or an employment discrimination case, old cases, they use language that I wouldn't use today, right? Like negro for a Black person. It's in the case, it's in the legal case. So, because it's an old case, I think it's really important that we study history and that we know history and that we not take out the bad words from history, because I think that's part of understanding history. But there are many professors who are very nervous about whether to have that on your PowerPoint slides. Or when I have students sometimes read something, I let them know ahead of time because I know how worried they are. I'm like, you can skip words that you wouldn't use today, or you can replace those words,
Okay.
right? Because everyone's so hysterical about what if you say a word, even in a totally not just benign context, but for educational purposes. Same thing with women. There was a few years where there was a debate where some professors said they were no longer going to teach about rape because it was triggering
What?
students in the classroom. We must teach about rape. We cannot not teach about rape because someone is going to be triggered. If you're going to be triggered, either don't come to law school, or it's okay, I give warnings ahead of time, maybe excuse yourself at some point, but we need resilient people who can handle sometimes being triggered. And it's not because I don't have compassion for victims of sexual assault. I have tons of compassion, but we cannot live in a world where we cannot communicate. So we've seen this slow chipping away of how we're able to engage in conversations and discourse, because
Okay.
everyone's so worried about microaggressions and offending people and triggering people and blah, 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 blah. And then you're right. All of a sudden, we get to October 8th, and you literally have students screaming and chanting for death to the Jews,
Rashida Tlaib said that.
and that's okay.
Yeah.
So I don't understand that either. I mean, right? Like this was if you think that microaggressions are problematic. Now, again, I disagreed with them on microaggressions. So I have a broader, I want to protect more speech. But if you think that microaggressions should be punished, then you must punish chants seeking genocide of the Jews. And so,
Okay.
yeah, those presidents, that was so embarrassing. I was embarrassed for them, watching them come before in those hearings, and the way that they weren't able to answer these basic questions about whether it's a violation of their code of conduct for people to be calling for genocide of Jews. Of course, it was a violation of their code of conduct. Um, it was embarrassing. And yeah,
Depends
they're
on, I mean,
hypocrites.
I'm not a lawyer. Like,
Mhm.
what do you mean by depends on the context? I didn't understand that. I was
Okay.
dumbfounded.
So forget about, they weren't following their own rules about what is allowed speech, because for all of these years, they've had very, very, a lot of restriction. But if you are following the First Amendment and not your code of conduct at your school, if you actually follow the First Amendment, then calling for the destruction of a people is not is a protected speech. It is protected speech, unless that speech is going to incite imminent violence.
Sorry,
And the
is it
speaker,
a protected speech? Sorry.
it is protected speech.
So I can go out and say that I want to wipe out a country.
Yes,
I won't be arrested for it.
no. The only way you can be arrested for it is if you are now knowingly inciting people to do that. Like if there's a crowd of people next to you and you say, and there's a crowd listening to you, okay? And you
Okay.
say, death to Israel, and they chant back, death to Israel. You say, death to the Jews. They chant back, death to the Jews.
So,
I want all the Jews to be dead. Yes, let's have all the Jews to be dead. And then there's a Jewish person walking. And then you say to them, go get him. Now it's not protected speech because there was a specific target, an actual person that you were
Okay.
inciting violence against. But if you're just saying it to the air as an idea, it is protected speech until
Okay.
it becomes incitement. Now, just because it's protected speech doesn't mean, just because it's protected speech doesn't mean it's not also harassing. And if it's harassing, it still violates Title VI. Even if it's otherwise protected, if it now becomes a form of harassment and the
Okay.
students are being harassed on campus, if it's happening on the college campus, then the
Okay.
school risks losing its funding.
Okay.
It's there are I think
So you
I
are,
think mhm.
sorry, you're saying Claudine Gay was well within her rights to
No,
say what she said?
no, because the question was, does it violate your code of conduct? And the answer was, yes, it
Okay.
does. That was the answer. If the question had been, is this a complicated First Amendment question? It's a
Okay.
different answer. And Harvard is a private university. So Harvard, there's no, you don't have freedom of speech against Harvard. So that's important. Freedom of speech is only against the government. Like the government cannot infringe on protected speech. But
Okay.
a private employer and a
Okay.
private school, of course they
Okay.
can, because
Okay.
that's why they have so many rules that infringe on speech.
Okay. I cannot just enter, barge into your house and say death to the Jews. You can have me arrested, right?
Well, if you barge into my house, I can have you arrested, but not
Okay.
for what you said because you came into my, right? Like it, people can say really terrible, vile things out in public. And most of those terrible hate speech is protected speech. I think the United States has the most speech protections, probably of any other country in the world, of any country I've studied. We have
Okay.
very, very strong protection of speech, again, until it is inciting imminent. So it has to be now violence. You have to incite violence now, not violence in a year,
Okay.
violence now.
Okay. I'm just curious now. Do you remember Rashida Tlaib was censured in the House for saying some anti-Semitic things recently? Do you remember
No,
that?
tell me again what happened?
Uh, do you remember Rashida Tlaib was censured in the Congress for saying some
Oh,
anti-Semitic things?
I
She
actually I
she
didn't know she was. Uh-huh.
she tweeted something like "River to the sea, Palestine will be free," which was straight out of Hamas charter.
Okay.
And
And they did censor her?
both Democrats and Republicans, it was a bipartisan censure. But
Good.
now I'm wondering, she should have been protected by free speech, right? Why she
No,
was
but it a no. I think the rules of the House and the Senate are different and specific, and they didn't put her in, I think it was probably that's not considered an infringement.
okay?
I don't know enough about it to answer, so I would really need to look into how the rules of Congress, what happens when they're restricted. But government employees, their speech can be restricted because that's government speech. Oh, here is the answer. I do know the answer. When you are speaking for the government,
Hmm.
your government speech can be
No,
unlawful.
when she was speaking, she was representing her congressional district. Okay.
Yeah, so she's a member. Yeah, if you're speaking for the government, she works for the government. If you're speaking for the government,
She
it's
she was
very,
not speaking for the federal government. She was speaking for no. She's a federal. Okay, sorry.
yeah,
Congress is
she's
a
a
federal.
federal employee. So
Okay.
she is speaking, so she is the government, like she is the government. So her speech is arguably is government speech.
Okay.
And government speech is subject to different rules than private individual speech.
Okay.
You have to take my constitutional law class. We do a whole session on First Amendment. It takes,
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
it's
I'm
so
sorry.
complicated. It really is. It's a very
No,
complicated.
I didn't know this actually. I got learn new things actually. I didn't
Good.
know. Okay. Yeah. So just considering the various pogroms and the genocides that have been unleashed on Jewish people, the period since 1945 has relatively been a peaceful period for Jewish people. You had a Jewish state created for the Jewish people, and yeah, they were living in a relatively secured period in history. Has that holiday from history ended on October the 7th? What is the new reality for Jewish people after the October 7th in this world?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. We're in a new reality after October 7th. I think also it wasn't, I mean, yes, I would say that for American Jews and Canadian Jews, since World War II, it has been a golden era.
Okay,
Jewish life in the United States and Canada. That's
okay,
not true in the rest of the world.
okay,
French Jews have had a lot of difficulties already for quite a long time, and many French Jews have left France for Israel. Also, all the Jews of the Muslim world had to flee those countries or were expelled from those countries in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, and also came to Israel. Also, being a Jew in Israel has not been a peaceful, easy time since 1945 because Israel has had, it had to fight for its existence in 48, in 56, in 67, in 73, and then repeatedly with Lebanon, and then with Gaza in 2014, and then again in 2018 or 2019, and then now. So like, I mean, Israel has been a war-ravaged country this entire time. But certainly North American Jewry, specifically US and Canada, it has been a golden era. And in some European countries, I mean, even in England also, England has had really bad anti-Semitism for a long time. And the English Jewish community, the British Jews, um, were very quiet, for a long time. Like they kept their heads down so as not to cause trouble because they were always worried about anti-Semitism since after World War II. Ireland is violently anti-Jewish and anti-Israel. So in the US, now the US matters because half the world's Jews live in the US and almost half. And that's, Israel's population and America's Jewish population are the same now.
yeah,
And then you have the rest of the world's Jews. They're tiny communities all over the world. So when we look at what's happening for American Jews, um, everything has changed. If you ask American Jews, we're calling them, we have a term for this now too. There are a lot of October 8th Jews. These are Jews who before October 8th, they weren't so connected with their Jewish identity. They felt assimilation was working. They felt really safe. And they also weren't so connected with world Jewry or with Israeli Jews. They were just kind of going about their business. And all of a sudden on October 8th, they realized that they are Jewish and that being Jewish can be very difficult sometimes. And so suddenly they're really like in crisis and also becoming much more connected to their identity. Yeah, everything changed. For me, my whole world changed after October 7th. For me, it was October 7th, not October 8th. October 7th, absolutely. And then October 8th as well, completely changed my reality. The stories of the Holocaust, I now realize that when my grandparents would warn me about when they come for us. That's how they would warn, And my mother only had two children because her mother told her not to have more children. My mom wanted to have more children, and her mother told her, you can't have more children because when they come, you grab one and your husband grabs one and you can run away. And it's not so easy if you have more than two children. So I remember thinking about my grandmother's perspective and thinking, I now understand that what I really believed was that there was something different about humanity in the 1930s and 1940s, and that somehow people today weren't capable of that anymore, or people today wouldn't fall for those lies that were told about the Jews that led to the Holocaust. People today were smarter or more enlightened. We were almost, I thought, living in a post-history time. And I learned that I was wrong, that in fact, as far as I'm concerned, the lies, the blood libels, that's what we call lies against
yeah,
the Jewish
yeah,
people,
blood label.
the blood libels that were spread about the Jews by the Nazis, that we were a different race, that we were like
Yeah,
rats, that we were shapeshifters, sometimes that our women had magic, that we were demons, all of these lies, they sound so stupid, kind of like when you asked me about the Black Israelites, right? They sound such stupid lies. And I thought people today are smarter than that. But here we are. And now these lies that we're committing genocide, that we're an apartheid state, that we're colonizers, that Jesus was a Palestinian, these lies are also so idiotic and millions of people believe them. So I learned that history, I used to think history was in the past, that history was history. And
Okay.
now I've learned that we are living in history.
Okay.
It's just a continuation. It's the same
Okay.
story continuing. We're not after.
Okay. Your grandparents are still there or alive?
No, they passed away.
Okay.
Are they still living? Is that what you asked?
Yeah.
Oh, no, no.
Okay. What would they think about the current state of Jewish people?
Um, I'm really glad that they're not here to see it, honestly. I think it would be I think it would be very traumatic for them. I think that they would, when we talk about trigger, I think that this would really have
Okay.
I really feel bad. I know Holocaust survivors, not my grandparents, but I know a Holocaust survivor in Pittsburgh who I see from time to time. He's actually an extraordinary
You,
man.
you belong to the Pittsburgh, you attend the Pittsburgh synagogue?
The synagogue with the shooting.
Yeah, 2018, one guy, white supremacist.
Yeah, I was there a week before. It wasn't my synagogue, but I was there the Saturday before. I was there for a bat mitzvah. And
Okay.
I taught there when I was in college. I was a teacher at that synagogue, and it's only like 3 blocks from my house.
Okay.
But thank God I wasn't there, of course, and thank God what didn't happen the week before, because the week before, because there was a bat mitzvah, the synagogue was packed. And when the shooter came on October 27th, he came very early in the morning, and most people weren't there yet, but also there was no bat mitzvah that weekend or bar mitzvah. So it was only the people who come every week, which is a much smaller group of people. A friend of mine, I mean, her father was killed. I saw her actually last night. Her father was killed in that shooting, and my son, that year, he went there every Wednesday morning. He went to that synagogue with his class from school. They would go to that synagogue every Wednesday morning and pray with the congregants. And so 3 of the people who were killed, he knew them. And one of them, she used to drive him back to school from synagogue every Wednesday. So, I mean, we all knew them. These were really precious members of our community. It was a terrible attack. Yeah.
It's really, really difficult. So my next the other thing is the past couple of decades there has been a steep increase in the number of pro-Palestine, pro-Arab politicians getting elected across the parliament in Europe. As a
Mhm.
result, you can see that anti-Semitism has skyrocketed in Europe. Now America is heading down that path. Now you have elected Congress members who don't even bother to hide their anti-Semitism. So, how should America address this issue? How can USA learn from Europe?
I'm with you. This is my big fear for the United States, is that we are headed down the same path as Europe. And I don't know why more Americans don't see it. Europe is the future that we are going to if we continue down this path. Um, and what we need, we talked about this earlier, we need the Democratic Party's power structure to be very clear that there is no room in the party for these hateful, fringe, anti-American, anti-Israel, anti-Jewish, pro-Islamist voices. We
Name
need
the
to
names.
kick
Take the
them.
names.
They need to kick them. What did you say? Kick them out of the party.
Take the names. I know who you're talking about.
That's right. We need to get rid of Ilhan Omar. I mean, we thank goodness Cori Bush is gone and Jamal Bowman is gone, but that's through an election thanks to American citizens taking this into their hands. But we need the leaders of the party. So we need people like Josh Shapiro and Chuck Schumer and Barack Obama and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton is actually, I mean, the Clintons have been pretty good on this. And Bill Clinton. We need the leaders of the party, also the present day leaders, Nancy Pelosi. We need all of those people to say very clearly, unequivocally, Ilhan Omar, you are no longer a Democrat. We are stripping you of this title because you don't represent what this party stands for. Rashida Tlaib, also, you are not a member of this party. Summer Lee, you are not a member of this party. Bernie Sanders, anyway, he's an independent, so that's different.
Bernie Sanders is himself is a Jewish, right? He,
Yeah, I would like to excommunicate him if it's an option, but I want to also point out he does not live a Jewish life. He
yeah.
does not have a Jewish family. He does not have Jewish children. It's very nice that when he was a teenager, he went to a kibbutz for a minute, but that doesn't really make him. I understand that like under Jewish law, halachically, he's Jewish because his
Okay.
mother.
He's as Jewish as I am.
He has Jewish blood, but he doesn't live a Jewish life. And so he doesn't speak for us. He definitely doesn't speak for us.
Okay, okay. So since you said this, you talked about Nancy Pelosi's and Clinton's and Obama's. I feel that in his heart of heart, Biden is a Zionist and he loves Israel. But after October 7th, he has capitulated to this far left of the Democratic Party that is nothing but anti-Semitic. How can the Democratic Party address this? You said they have to, show the door. I mean, they have to show the door to Ilan Omar's and the Rashida Tlaib's. Is it that simple? Because they are popular leaders in their own constituencies. So how does the Democratic Party regain its soul?
Hmm. Yeah, so I agree. I also believe that Biden was a Zionist. Here's what I'll say though about Biden.
Was
I, I say was because I don't think, honestly, I mean, when I watched that debate before Biden stepped down, when I watched that debate and I was in a state of absolute shock. Biden is no longer competent. Okay. So I don't know what he believes now. And I also don't know who was running the country for the last 2 years because
yeah.
he certainly wasn't capable of running the country. So I don't know if it was Jill Biden. I don't know if it was his chief of staff. I don't know who's been in charge, which is also a horrific betrayal of American democracy to have a president who is not fit to be president. We also had this problem with Reagan. So it's again, both sides of both political parties have this.
No, you had the last time it happened was I think Woodrow Wilson. Now the report. I mean
No,
now.
Reagan was also toward the end of his presidency, Reagan was no longer there. I mean, he was not cognitively the same by the end of his
Okay,
presidency.
no,
He was speaking for us.
yeah, I read somewhere that Edith Wilson was the first female president of USA because she actually
Oh,
was
I
making
understand
this.
what you mean. Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Now I understand
So
what you
she was actually making decisions on foreign policy and national security, everything.
mean. So yeah, so I don't know who's been leading the country, but in any event, um, I'm really disappointed that I mean, Jewish the Jewish people should not be politicized. And we have now been politicized. It used to be that both parties fully supported Israel and also Jewish Americans. And now we have problems in both parties. We have a
Yeah.
problem on the far left and a problem on the far right.
The horseshoe theory, right?
Mhm.
The horseshoe theory, like they say this, right? The far
Yes,
right.
exactly. It's
Yeah,
really a circle,
yeah,
they meet right there.
yeah.
It's devastating and it's terrifying that Jewish security has become a political issue, both in the US and in Israel. And I don't know what that means for the future. I mean, again, it looks like we're moving in the direction of Europe. I think also it's so bad for America because what we're seeing is we do not want the fringe voices to win. When the Tea Party, when was that? Back in the 90s? Was it the 90s? No. Whenever the Tea Party,
2000s, 2000s.
okay, when the Tea Party started taking control essentially of the Republican Party. I was a Democrat and I was watching this and thinking, oh my goodness, they're going to destroy the party. I can't believe they're letting them destroy the party. And we watched them destroy the party. And now we're having our Tea Party moment. We, the Democrats, are having our own Tea Party moment, and it's called the Squad. And we are allowing them to destroy the party. And we need to wake up. I thought that this election would be a wake up call for the Democrats, and they would say, oh boy, we lost for reasons that aren't because they're reasons within our control, right? Like we lost because we failed to demonstrate to the American people that we are the party of the people. And they did. They failed because they went to the fringe and everybody watched that and thought like, what are they doing? All these, and it's not just on Israel, it's also going to the far left. Some of the gender issues that the far left has embraced are absurd. Some of them, it's not, I fully support uh, dignity and human rights for everyone. But some of the ideas that the far left and the idea of the way that they've tried to restrict speech and canceling people and microaggressions and all of this, it's really toxic. And I think that most Americans have watched that and said, this doesn't represent me. You know, they've allowed these ivory tower academic ideas that are purely theoretical, that have no business in the real world. They have allowed them to take over their party, and it's very upsetting.
Okay. So President Trump has appointed some staunch pro-Israelis in his cabinet, starting be it Eli Stefanik or be it Pete Hegseth or other cabinet or Marco Rubio. So how do you see the America-Israel relationship developing under the Trump administration? Are you hopeful and optimistic about it?
I am cautiously hopeful and optimistic.
Okay.
Yes, I'm, you know, just because I think I'm cautious about everything right now. And I also think that we know that Trump is sometimes can be volatile and he can change his mind very suddenly. And when someone makes him mad, he fires them, and even now withdraws their security detail, which is very concerning.
Absolutely.
Um, so I'm hesitant and cautious, but also I'm also so thankful. I mean, I really feel like Trump right now has really made true on his promises to Jewish Americans and on his promises to all Americans for taking terrorism seriously.
Mhm.
And he's showing that through some of these appointments.
Mhm.
So I like these appointments. I mean, I think that they're very positive.
Okay.
And I really like the moral clarity of a lot of the people that he has appointed
Okay.
when it comes to Israel. Yeah.
Okay. I don't know much about Pete Hegseth, but he was asked this question, what should Israel do? He said that Israel should be fighting this war until it eliminates Hamas. It was clear and crisp.
Yeah.
I,
I agree. I also think Israel, I mean, you know, Douglas Murray, he's amazing,
yeah,
brilliant man. And he says one of the problems is that the world has never let Israel win a war.
yeah,
Should have won. We did. This is not the first time we're fighting Hamas. We
okay,
should have beat them a long time ago.
okay,
Instead, we have allowed them to get stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. And once again, we're being really pushed very hard into a ceasefire that you know is complicated and that is it's problematic. It's probably not in Israel's long-term benefit. I mean, now's the time for us to hit them even harder when they're so weakened. I mean, the Israel only started winning this war, I think, just a few months ago. It felt like the tides turned with the pager
yeah,
attack with
it
Hezbollah.
started with the pager
And
attack, yeah,
and when Sinwar was killed, like there were a few things that happened, and it was like, okay, the tides were changing, the wind
okay,
was changing, Israel was winning, and boom, now we stop. I want the hostages home, so I'm conflicted. But as far as just from a strategy of the war, and what's good for Israel and what's good for America, not only does Israel need to defeat Hamas, Israel needs to destroy Iran's nuclear program.
okay,
That's
okay.
also what Israel needs to do. And Israel can do it with American support, but not without.
Yeah, it's actually I read. In 2008, Bibi Netanyahu proposed that he wanted to eliminate Iran's nuclear capability by force, but Obama restrained him. Should Bibi not have listened to Obama and gone ahead with his plan?
I don't know because I don't know. I mean, Israel needs American support.
Okay,
So these are diplomatic negotiations that I don't know what the consequences are. I mean, maybe now he'll do it. Yeah, I wish he would have done it, but would that have, I don't know what that would have
okay,
meant for the
okay,
US-Israel relationship.
okay.
You know, when Israel destroyed Iraq's nuclear facility,
Yes.
you know, everyone, you know, did like two, you shouldn't have done that. And the whole, and everyone in the
Yeah.
world should be thanking Israel every day for having done
I
that.
read, I read somewhere that Israel did not let America know about their plans. They went ahead and did that, and only when they accomplished the task, they let America know about
So
this.
that's probably the better approach. At this point, Israel, from what I understand, I don't believe that Israel
Okay,
doesn't have like the bombers that it needs to be able to drop the 30,000 pound ton, whatever bomb that would need to be dropped to actually get it. And it would need US. So,
okay,
I mean, listen, you know who I hope does it? I hope we do it. I hope the US does it.
okay.
I think, I don't know why the US would allow Iran to become nuclear. That is a disaster for us. We should take out. We have the ability to do it. We have the power to do it. Iran can't mess with us, and we should take out their nuclear program for sure. But
Okay. Okay. So I'm just curious. I mean, are Hamas worse than the Nazis? Because at least, the Nazis wanted to wipe out the Jews and they wanted to live and conquer this world. But this Hamas, they want to die. They don't care if they live or die. They want to just eliminate the Jews. That's their top goal. I would say they're even more dangerous than the Nazis. So, but why we are not showing the same? Why the world is not showing the same horror that they showed for Nazis?
I think it goes back to the cultural Marxist oppressor oppressed ideology and this idea that yeah, I don't know, because they're Arab, somehow they're not responsible for their actions. It really is racist. It's a racist idea. They infantilize the Arabs
Okay.
of the world and pretend like they have no free will and that they're not responsible for their decisions and that they're not to be held accountable for their actions. Why? I don't know. Are they worse than the Nazis? I don't know. They're, I think they're differently awful. I don't know that I would make one worse than the other. I think that they're different. It's they might be more dangerous in terms of Nazi ideology was not religious.
Okay.
And so it was, it had to be based in kind of reason because it's
Okay.
not based in magic or religion.
Okay.
It has to be based in reason. Like we're going to destroy these people because they're ruining our country, or we have to destroy these people because there's some kind of threat to our system. With the Hamas and Hezbollah and ISIS and all of these crazy terrorist groups, they believe that they're going to have, ultimate. I mean, they're going to have glory in heaven and be rewarded with 72 virgins, and that this is the whole purpose. So when you have like this, it's not about reason anymore. It's about this mythical idea of the reward you're going to get in a future life, in a future existence, in a different plane. So at least with the ideology of Nazism, I think you should be we should be able to reason out of it. And with Islamism, there's no reasoning out of it because it's not based in reason. It's a
Okay.
death cult.
Yeah.
It's really almost satanic in terms of that they believe that it is their duty to brutally murder children and that they will be rewarded for it. That's a death cult.
Okay. 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 So the Hamas deliberately uses kids and women, young kids and young women for its terror activities. They even use 13-year-old and 14-year-old kids. So when the 13-year-old and 14-year-old kids carry bombs and weapons, you have no choice but to kill them. Uh, but the so-called human rights activists are shouting that Israel is not discriminating between civilians and the terrorists. So how can you explain this conundrum to the world?
Um, I mean, we're trying to explain it. I don't think it's working. First of all, we're not in this, first, there's two different things. One is what's actually happening, and if the human rights activists disagree with that. But then there's all the lies that are being told. So, when they're saying Israel is indiscriminately bombing, that was never true. Israel is never indiscriminately bombing. Israel takes very precise measures to decide where and what and when to bomb. If Israel was indiscriminately bombing in Gaza, 2 million people would be dead in Gaza. And that's not the case. And so it's absolutely false that Israel is indiscriminately bombing. Israel is very careful, and there's an entire process that needs to be followed before they're bombing. As far as soldiers on the ground who are in a war zone, in an active war zone, I believe they are doing their absolute best to follow international law. It is very difficult for them because they are fighting an enemy that doesn't wear uniforms and that hides among civilians. So that's how they're fighting that war. And you know, I don't know what to say. You know, the human rights violation is that Hamas is not wearing uniforms, and that Hamas is intentionally embedding itself among civilians and in hospitals and in schools and under houses and hiding weapons inside of people's homes and all of that. Why is the human rights world not responding to that? One, because some of them believe the lies. Two, because some of them are anti-Semites. Three, because some of them are useful idiots. I think probably those are the three reasons.
Okay, okay, got it. So yeah, thank you so much for this interview. It has been an educating and illuminating experience. Thank you,
Thank you. I've really enjoyed talking to you. It's been my pleasure also.
thank you, and